Welcome back to Women Writers in Chinese History. This video introduces some notable stories about the abandoned woman from the class of the gentry woman. In particular, we'll focus on the story of the eloping widow Zhuo Wenjun, the heroine of one of the most famous love stories in the Chinese tradition, and the story of Su Hui, the putative author of the best-known palindrome poem, or Hui in Chinese history. First, the eloping widow, Zhuo Wenjun. As a teaser to her story, let me begin with this quote from Red Brush. The moment the rich young widow Zhuo Wenjun eloped with the brilliant but poor poet Sima Xiangru, she became the heroine of one of the most popular Chinese love stories of all time. The original story is included in Sima Xiangru's biography in historical records, Shiji, the famous history book compiled during the 1st century BCE. Now, let's read this story from historical records together, as it's full of vivid details. When the filial prince of Liang died, Xiangru returned to his hometown, but was too poor to make ends meet. He had always been friends with Wang Ji, the magistrate of Linqiong. Ji said to him, "You should come and visit me now that you have traveled so much, in the hopes of making a career, but without success." So Xiangru went to visit him and was housed in the magistrate's office. The magistrate put on a show of treating him with great regard and esteem, going each day to pay his respects to Xiangru. In the beginning, Xiangru received him, but later he would pretend to be ill and get a servant to send Ji away. This only resulted in the magistrate treating him with even greater deference. In Linqiong, there were many rich men. Zhuo Wangsun owned 800 slaves, and Cheng Zheng also owned a few hundred. These two men said to each other, "The magistrate is entertaining an important guest. Why don't the two of us invite him over?" The two of them summoned the magistrate, and by the time he arrived, the Zhuo family had laid out a feast for more than 100 guests. At noon, they invited Sima Xiangru, but he excused himself, claiming that he was ill and could not come. But since the magistrate did not dare start eating without him, he went in person to fetch him. This left Xiangru with no choice but to go along. All those present were filled with admiration when they saw him. When everyone was merry with drink, the magistrate of Linqiong came forward and gave a performance on the zither. Then he said to Xiangru, "I've been told that you're also fond of playing. If you don't mind, please play us a tune." Xiangru at first refused politely, but then played one or two pieces. Upon this point, let me digress a little to introduce the musical instrument in question, the zither or guqin. Traditionally, the guqin was the ultimate instrument to express a scholar's inner cultivation. On the other hand, upper-class and literate women played the instrument as well, as we can see on this painting. Here is another example of a woman playing the zither. With this context in mind, let's return to the story in the sound of this zither music. As the story goes, when Xiangru came to Linqiong, he was accompanied by an entourage of mounted horsemen, courteous and gracious. He was extremely sophisticated. When he joined the party at Zhuo's place and played the zither, Wenjun secretly spied on him from behind the door and fell deeply in love with him, fearing only that he would get away from her. Here is a modern illustration of this famous scene of listening to the zither. And let's go back to the story. After the gathering was over, Xiangru had someone bribe Wenjun's servant with large gifts so that she would communicate his devotion to her mistress. That very night, Wenjun eloped with Xiangru, and together they hastily fled to Chengdu. The house they lived in consisted of nothing but 4 bare walls. Zhuo Wenjun was enraged and said, "My daughter is really useless. I cannot bring myself to kill her, but I will not give her a cent." Whenever people would happen to mention her name to Wenjun, he would refuse to listen. After a while, Wenjun started to feel unhappy and said to Xiangru, "We'd better go to Linqiong and borrow some money from my brothers so that we can get by. Why should we impose such suffering ourselves?" Xiangru returned with her to Linqiong, where he sold all of his carriages and horses in order to buy a wine shop. They then opened for business, and he had Wenjun tend the bar. He himself, wearing only his undershorts, would go together with the servants to wash the cups and dishes in the marketplace. When Zhuo Wenjun heard about this, he was so ashamed that he barred his gate and refused to go out. Wenjun's brothers and the other gentlemen all said to him, "You have only 1 son and 2 daughters. It's not money you're short of. Now Wenjun has lost her chastity to Sima Xiangru. He, for good reason, is tired of traveling around. He may be poor, but his talent is undeniable. Yet you let them wander about. What is the purpose of dishonoring them like that?" So Zhuo Wenjun ended up giving Wenjun 100 slaves and 1,000,000 copper coins as her share of his fortune, as well as all the clothes, blankets, and other valuables from her wedding trousseau. Wenjun then returned with Xiangru to Chengdu, where they bought a house and fields and became rich. Here we come to the conclusion of this story, as the authors of Red Brush comment. And so the story ends happily. In the meantime, Sima Xiangru's extravagant rhapsodies had attracted the attention of Emperor Wu, who summoned him to court and showered him with honors. In later centuries, Zhuo Wenjun became the exemplar of the smart young woman who discerns the true potential of the brilliant but poor student, attaches herself to him despite all parental opposition, loyally supports him through all his adversities, and eventually shares in his inevitable glory. And here are some images of Zhuo Wenjun based on the story, one with her holding a zither, the other portraying her as a bartender. Even though Wenjun's elopement with Sima Xiangru has been celebrated as a great love story, the account in historical records makes it clear that Sima Xiangru planned it all out at the very beginning, and he was at least in part after the wealth of Wenjun's family. Later, their relationship likely turned sour at one point when Sima Xiangru intended to take a younger concubine. Supposedly, Wenjun wrote a poem entitled White Hair Lament, 白头吟, to dissuade her husband from the plan, and she succeeded. This story is again recorded in the book of anecdotes that includes the famous story on Wang Zhaojun's portrait, various notes from the western capital, Xijing Zaji. Various notes from the western capital does not include the poem itself. However, a poem with the title White Hair Lament and attributed to Zhuo Wenjun appears in New Songs from the Jade Terrace the poetry anthology compiled around 540 during the Southern Liang dynasty, and focusing on the topic of women and love. We have introduced this anthology earlier in the lecture on concubine ban. The poem is almost certainly a later forgery, since it's written in the 5-character shi form that was very rare during Sima Xiangru and Zhuo Wenjun's time. Nevertheless, Zhuo Wenjun was a highly literate woman who might have composed literary pieces during her lifetime, and the poem became very well known up to today. Let's take a look at it together, as it provides another classic example for the image of the abandoned wife. As brilliant as the snow on yonder mountain, as splendid as the moon amidst the clouds, have been told that you now love another, and so I've come to say goodbye forever. 岂如山上雪，皎若云间月，闻君有两意，故来相决绝. Today we meet over a pint of wine. Tomorrow morning we'll meet at the canal. And as we tarry by the Emperor's Canal, the water flows both east and west. 今日斗酒会，明旦沟头水。妾蝶玉钩上，沟水东西流. How sad and lonely, oh, how sad and lonely. When one gets married, there's no need to cry. Just hope to find a man who will always love you and will not leave you when your hair turns white. 凄凄复凄凄，嫁娶不须提。愿得一心人，白首不相离. The fishing pole, how pliantly it bends. The fish he's caught, how lustrous its tail. What's precious in a man is his character. What need is there for money and wealth? 竹竿何袅袅，鱼尾何筛筛。男儿重义气，何用钱刀为? The poem is full of evocative images on the lovers' relations, as the authors of Red Brush have analyzed. The angler and the fish at the end of his line is an old image for the lover and the beloved. The images of the brilliant snow and splendid moon in the first 2 lines of this poem have given rise to a host of different interpretations. They have been regarded variously as symbols of the splendid love of formal days, the pure virtue of the wife about to be deserted, the inconstancy of the husband's love, the blatancy of the husband's betrayal, and last but not least, the white hair of the aging wife. The most famous line from the poem, still well known today, are those that evoke the image of the white hair as a wish for long-lasting love. Just hope to find a man who will always love you and will not leave you when your hair turns white. 愿得一心人，白首不相离. Nowadays, these lines are often used to express a profound, lifelong love. Yet ironically, the poem's original context stemmed from the deterioration of a romantic relationship and the fundamentally unequal gender relations surrounding the romance. Next, let's learn about the story of another gentrywoman who supposedly won back the heart of her husband through her literary talent, this time in an even more amazing manner. This is the story of Su Hui and her palindrome poem, Hui Wen Shi. First, what is a palindrome? In English, it's a phrase that reads the same backward as forward. Simple examples are madam or nurse's room. The meaning of a Chinese palindrome poem, or Hui Wen Shi, is somewhat different. It means a poem that can be read forward and backward, or sometimes diagonally as well, always with rhyming patterns. As the authors of Red Brush explain, Classical Chinese is the perfect language for palindromes, since the overwhelming majority of its words consist of a single syllable, and declensions and conjugations are unknown. That is, there are no words that designate gender, number, grammatical parts, and tense, etc. in Classical Chinese, thus making writings that can be read from different directions a lot easier than with other languages. The palindrome poetic form will be an ultimate demonstration of one's literary skills. Interestingly, the most famous and legendary palindrome in the tradition is ascribed to a woman, Su Hui, who lived in northern China during the second half of the 4th century. This particular palindrome is made up of a total of 841 characters, arranged in a square with 29 characters on each side. By reading this square horizontally, vertically, diagonally, and various other ways, one can generate thousands of rhyming poems. First, let's read Su Hui's story from the History of Jin. Dou Tao's wife, Lady Su, was a native of Shiping. Her personal name was Hui, and her style name was Ruolan. At the time of Fujian, Dou Tao was prefect of Qinzhou, but was later banished to the flowing sands of the western regions. Filled with longing for him, Lady Su wove a poem into brocade to send to him. One could read it in all directions, and the phrases were mournful and sad. It consisted of a total of 840 characters, but most of the text has been lost. The History of Jin does not include Su Hui's poem, which was supposedly lost by that point. The palindrome attributed to her as we have it now started to circulate during the Ming and the Qing dynasties. In Ming and the Qing writings, the palindrome is usually accompanied by a preface attributed to China's only woman emperor Wu Zetian from the Tang dynasty. The preface tells a story about Su Hui being abandoned by her husband due to her jealousy against a concubine. In regret, Su wove the palindrome. And here are excerpts from this later preface. Lady Su regretted her actions, and filled with remorse, she wove a palindrome of brocade. The 5 colors contrasted vividly, and their brilliance was blinding. Although the piece of brocade measured only 8 inches square, it contained over 200 poems. In total, there were 800 odd words that, when read horizontally and vertically, and backwards and forwards, always formed stanzas and sentences. Not a single dot or stroke of the characters was missing. Her marvelous talents and feelings were unmatched by anyone past or present. She called her work the maze pattern. When those who read it had a hard time understanding what it said, Lady Su would smile and say to them, "Turning and twisting in all directions, it forms poems all by itself, but my loved one is the only one who can understand it all." Lady Su then dispatched a servant to take it to Xiangyang. When Dou Tao carefully read the brocade characters, he was moved by their marvelous excellence, and so he packed Yang Tai, the concubine, off to the land within the passes, and prepared a carriage and servants with costly gifts to go and fetch Lady Su. By the time she joined him in Xiangyang, their love and affection had doubled. Along with the circulation of Su Hui's story, we can also find traditional images like the one shown here with her portrait and her poem. And to better understand how the palindrome poem is supposed to work in the Chinese original, here is my rough translation of the poem made by the top line of the square text shown on the right. That is the highlighted part on the image, if you read forward from left to right. 秦清流楚积弦伤，琴曲发声悲催葬。因何咏思为空堂，心忧增慕怀惨伤。Clear sounds of the zither, the tune of Jin deepens my sorrows, the music and my longings in an empty hall, a burdened heart heavy with sadness. And here is the poem in reverse when you read it backward from right to left. 伤惨怀慕增忧心，堂空为思咏何因？藏催悲声发曲琴，伤弦基础留清琴。The sadness in my chest burdens my heart. In an empty hall, there are only my longings echoing the music. Deep and sorrowfully sound form a tune of Qin. Its repercussions flow over the clear zither. In this manner, Su Hui's palindrome can generate thousands of poems. One estimate I found is 7,958 poems. Also notably, rather than writing her poem, Su Hui is supposed to wove out her poem as a piece of brocade with 5 colors. Other than increasing the amount of labor and effort in making this object, the story also indicates a strong association between female writing and weaving, which we have discussed as an essential part of women's work in traditional China. Here are images showing women in the process of weaving cloth. Weaving was a complicated process, mostly involving female labor, that rested behind the creation of beautiful brocades shown on the right. Embroidery is another important part of women's work in the making of various domestic objects. As the authors of Red Brush comment, while for men, weaving was a commonly used metaphor for literary composition, for women, weaving and writing are often seen as contradictory. The drudgery of a woman's work left no time for the pursuit of literature, and we often find women writers in later ages referring to their writings as having been hastily composed in the rare free time found between their weaving or needlework duties. Su Hui, however, seamlessly fuses her wifely duties with her literary endeavors. And here is a quote from Professor Ann Wattener, who teaches here in the history department at UMM. Her weaving of words combine her literary and domestic skills into one activity. Su Hui's tangible combination of the domestic and the literary is a significant accomplishment. Her embroidered characters are admired for their perfection, a reflection not only on her literacy but also on her needlework skill. Finally, the authors of Red Brush made an interesting observation on how Su Hui's story and Empress Wu Zetian's preface attached to it might have emerged to enforce the notion of female subordination. Since if you still remember, according to later accounts, Su Hui made the palindrome brocade after she lost her husband's favors due to her jealousy against her husband's concubine. In the words of the authors of Red Brush, even more significant in the eyes of traditional readers, Su Hui appears to have used her brocade palindrome to express her contrition for her insubordination, and in so doing succeeded in re-establishing a proper marital relationship. In the Ming and the Qing dynasties, the preface by Empress Wu Zetian, herself perhaps the greatest rebel against the norms of patriarchal society, ironically helped to establish Su Hui's palindrome as a paean to wifely duty and women's subordination to men, and as the perfect symbol of the marginal place of women's literature in late imperial society. On this note, let's conclude this presentation. This is the last video for the week. I hope that you've enjoyed all the stories. Please complete the quiz below this video and proceed to the pre-class reflections.